May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord.
Amen.
I've heard it said, and perhaps you have too, that in Luke's Gospel, Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. In fact, Luke's Gospel has more mealtime scenes than any of the other Gospels. Although there are numerous examples of table fellowship and instruction in the Gospels, this is the only account of these specific incidents. While clearly two separate teachings, one about humility and the other about hospitality, it's almost poetic how Luke brings them together. Since Jesus is addressing the first teaching to guests at a banquet, and the second to the hosts of a banquet, it's very natural that these two teachings would be paired together at a meal. As far as what Jesus is teaching in these readings, the poetry may not be so obvious. As a Christian, and particularly as a priest, I always hate to disagree with Jesus. But it sounds at first as though Jesus is encouraging false humility. Don't sit in a seat of honor and risk the public shame of being asked to move. Instead, choose the lowest seat so that your host may move you to a better one. It seems to me that true humility would dictate that if you chose to sit at the lowest table, it would be because you were content to do so, not because you were expecting or hoping to be moved to a better seat, and certainly not to be disappointed or resentful if you were not moved. But if your choice of a lesser seat is based on that expectation, how could you not be disappointed or resentful if it doesn't happen? And I would like to think that a truly humble person, if asked to move to a lesser seat, would do so graciously. As far as Jesus' address to the hosts, how dreadful to think that you should never invite your family or friends to dinner. Especially dreadful to think that they may invite you to their house only out of obligation than a desire to spend time with you. I certainly understand Jesus teaching us to invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. But as I read this passage the first time, all I could picture in my mind was me showing up at a homeless shelter or a hospital and asking a bunch of people who I don't already know and who don't know each other to come to a dinner that I was hosting, in which there was no one else there but them. It seems like it might be a little awkward for everyone. But fortunately for me as a preacher, and for you, what usually starts out for me as a disagreement with scriptural teaching, usually after sufficient study, turns out to be simply a lack of understanding on my part. So let's take a closer look at the text. Although in today's world and in American culture, we tend to jockey for position and prestige with each other, in Jesus' time, people were more worried about impressing and gaining favor with God. Those in the parable who sat in the places of honor were the people who were so eager to show how well they were following God's law and maintaining their own purity, that they were willing to claim that seat of honor, even if it meant someone else not having it. Theologian N.T. Wright points out that there would be an obvious wider meaning as well. Within Luke's lifetime, thousands of non-Jews had become Christians, had entered, that is, into the dinner party prepared by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Many Jewish Christians, as we know from Acts, had found this difficult, if not impossible, to understand or approve. The desire to maintain their own places at the top of the ladder or at the table of honor made it difficult, if not impossible, for them to hear Jesus' teaching of a new kingdom. It's as if someone would say, I deserve to be favored by God, so I don't need His grace, mercy, and love. Or to imply that those who don't deserve it shouldn't have it. As one commentary so eloquently put it, humility is a quality of life open to persons who know that their worth is not measured by recognition from their peers, but by the certainty that God has accepted them. For Jesus, meals were a time of celebration and an inclusive fellowship that foreshadowed the inclusiveness of God's kingdom. Therefore, the hospitality offered to others was more than just good manners. In Jesus' time and culture, meals were eaten with intention not only to the food, but to those present around the table. They were often a social occasion. A guest invited into the home was accepted as an equal. It's understandable, therefore, that Jesus would have been watched closely to see whether he would follow the prescribed norms of etiquette, norms which were in place to allow both guest and host to be honored. The food at a meal, or the bread, held its own importance. We know from the story of Lazarus and the rich man that as long as one had food to eat and the other did not, the kingdom of God was not present. Breaking bread or sharing a meal with someone was equally important. In fact, according to one commentary that I read, the real test of whether the church included persons who were different was not at the point of baptizing them, but of eating with them. After all, the risen Lord has been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. If you look at the notation for today's gospel reading in your bulletin, you'll notice that it starts with verse 1 of chapter 14 and then skips to verses 7 through 14. The verses in between include a story about Jesus healing a man, even though it is the Sabbath. Although this is the third time in Luke that we have heard of Jesus healing on the Sabbath, this is the first time the healing has taken place in a meal rather than at the synagogue. Now, I have yet to find a commentary explaining why the people who appointed the readings in the Revised Common Lectionary made the choices they did. I would love to ask them why they chose to include the first verse of chapter 14, which seems to be much more applicable to the verses left out in today's reading than to the verses included. It's also worth noting that the healing story that was left out of today's reading is a story you will never hear on a Sunday in any of the 3-year cycle of readings. The only time you'll hear it in church is if you go to a weekday service. And not just any weekday service, but specifically the Friday of the week that we read Proper 25, which for all of you who are planning to go happens to be on October 28th this year. Clearly, the people who compiled the lectionary calendar did not feel this particular healing story was significant enough to the teaching on humility and hospitality. but it has its own significance in the overall message that Jesus came to teach. As I was reading my commentaries on these particular verses, I was aware of a real sense of empathy on my part toward the Pharisees that I don't usually pick up on. It probably shouldn't surprise me, given how much of a rule follower I am. In fact, not only do I prefer to follow rules, I prefer situations in which there are rules, and in which the rules are clearly laid out and upheld. Even with my hobbies, I choose crafts that have patterns, like counted cross-stitch or basket weaving, rather than the free-flowing creativity of painting or drawing. The Pharisees were rule followers. They were upholding, or trying to uphold, what they believed to be the truth with a capital T, and not just the capital T truth about something dealing with human concerns, whether trivial in nature or quite serious, but the capital T truth about God. The Sabbath was a special gift from God and was to be honored by careful observance. Now, this careful observance involves more than I think most of us may realize. Different communities believed different things. It was debated frequently. But I'd like to read to you just a little bit of a list that was in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, just to give you an idea of what they were wrestling with. Various Jewish groups took different positions on whether one would be allowed to rescue an animal from a ditch on the Sabbath, but there was apparently no such argument in the case of a child. The Mosaic law stipulated that one should help an animal in distress, but did not make clear whether this duty could be carried out on the Sabbath. The Damascus document takes the more stringent view. Let no beast be helped to give birth on the Sabbath day. And if it fell into a cistern or into a pit, let it not be lifted out on the Sabbath. On the other hand, the Mishnah, while it forbids delivering the young of cattle on a festival day, does allow one to summon a midwife for a woman delivering a baby, tying the umbilical cord and performing circumcision. So this wasn't the black and white picture that you and I quite often think of when we hear the gospel writers talk about the Pharisees and cast them in the negative light of those who are opposed to Jesus. Rather, these are people who have been raised their entire life and who have debated passionately and devoutly devoted themselves to upholding these laws, not only for themselves, but for their community. Now, I can't even count the number of times that I have preached that Jesus' coming challenged all of those societal norms and practices, challenged the power structures, challenged the understanding of God's kingdom, and that it was as simple as that. But just imagine how hard it would have been for those Pharisees and others to suddenly put aside all they knew and follow new practices. Jesus' act of healing the man pointed to a different standard, an entirely different vision of God's order for human society. When Jesus came and taught about the kingdom, religious duties were redefined. The ones who ended up crucifying Jesus, and perhaps the ones today who continue to crucify him figuratively, are the ones who ultimately could not or cannot accept the change of priorities within the kingdom of God. The shift in priorities which Jesus came to teach us through his words and his actions. A switch away from the time in which religious obligations and observances, according to the written law, much like the ones found in the Levitical Code, held the highest priority, even to the extent that healing on the Sabbath would never be acceptable unless a life was in danger. Where once the religious obligation was to honor God in very specific actions, at specifically prescribed times, even with the possible consequence of a fellow human suffering, or suffering longer than need be, Jesus tells us now that we are to honor God not by following the rules, but by loving each other and offering help when needed. All of those who flocked to Louisiana to help the victims of the flooding, whether they were Christian or not, are doing the work that Jesus calls us to do. N.T. Wright goes on he uses the words small-mindedness for those that exclude or push their way into the seat of honor. And he contrasts it with what he calls the large-heartedness love of God. He says, the small-mindedness which pushes itself forward and leaves others behind is confronted with a large-hearted love of God. All Christians are called to the same healthy dependence on God's love and the same generosity in sharing it with those in need. So, we are challenged today as Christians to figure out for ourselves, for our churches, for our families, and for our communities, what it would mean to celebrate God's kingdom so that the people at the bottom of the Ohio, at the end of the line, would find it to be good news. Things have changed. Before, we had strict rules regarding membership. Who could be a Christian? Who couldn't? Now all God's children are welcome. Without needing to worry about the specifics of the laws, the do's and the don'ts, the list of who's in and who's out, we are given a great gift. The freedom to create human community and enjoy the security of God's grace. Jesus is not telling us that our relationship with fellow humans should take priority over our religious obligations. He's telling us that taking care of our fellow human beings is our religious obligation.